All right, so in the last module, when we talked about Dart functions, we talked about part one of Dart functions, and those were the simplest of functions. They simply package a whole bunch of code together inside some curly braces so that when you want all of these instructions to be executed in one go, you can simply call the function by specifying its name. But it's rather curious how we've been using these parentheses and we've always left it empty. What are they for? Well, I like to think of these types of functions as the most basic type of functions. And there's actually three different levels of functions, if you will. If this is the most basic, then let's call it the vanilla flavor of functions. Now we're coming across the next flavor of functions. And we saw this in the code in the last lesson. We saw that we could specify an input to our function inside those parentheses, and we could use that input inside the function. And this makes our function far more adaptable because we can now get it to do slightly different things by providing a different input. So now let's talk about part two of Dart functions. We're leveling up our Dart functions. So coming back to our little robot, what if instead of just telling him to go and get milk, we could actually tell him how many bottles of milk to get? And we would do that by calling the function getMilk and providing an input in between the parentheses. So if we wanted 2 bottles, we would write 2. If we wanted 4 bottles, we would write 4. So that means that our little robot is a little bit more intelligent now. We don't have to always get 1 bottle of milk every single time it goes to the store. Instead of having a function that looks like this, where it's just a whole bunch of instructions packaged together into a block with a name, we now have some inputs inside the parentheses. And those inputs can be used inside the block of code to change the functionality of that block of code. And now we can use that input inside the function. For example, we could calculate the cost of getting X number of bottles, right? If they called get milk and they wanted 2 bottles of milk, then if 1 bottle of milk was £1.50, then that would be £3 for the total cost of the milk. Basically, we now have this input, or some might call an argument, and this is something that will modify the functionality of this function. But there's 2 important parts to this. And one is you have to specify the data type that goes into this function, and you also have to give it a name so that you can refer to it when you need it inside the curly braces of this block of code. Now, when you call the function, it also looks a little bit different. We still call it by its name, but inside the parentheses, instead of having an empty set of parentheses, we give it an input. So let's say we want to get 2 bottles of milk. Well, then the input now flows into the function and it becomes stored inside this name called bottles. Now, the first thing it checks is to make sure that it definitely is getting the right data type as the input. So it's definitely getting an integer in this case. And 2 is a whole number, so that's completely fine. So when we call getMilk, passing in the input of 2, it's almost like we're creating a new variable that is of data type int. It has a name of bottle and it has a value of 2. So now inside the curly braces of this function, we get to use this new variable, including to calculate the cost or do whatever we will with that input. Now, it's your part to apply this in practice. Head over to a dartpad and I want you to create a greeting robot. Now, this greeting robot is pretty simple. All it needs to do is to print a greeting, such as "Hello, Angela," to the console. Notice here I'm calling a function called greet and I'm passing in the input that's my name, but it could also be anybody else's name. And this name in here has to be put after a hello or a how do you do or howdy, and it has to be printed into the console. So go ahead and create this greet function that achieves this functionality. Pause the video and complete this challenge.